Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Wendy, Korbusieski, and we're looking at a passage from Psalm 55, verses 1 through 8. So we're going to have a theme this week. We're going to look at some practical principles for dealing with things like fear and hurt and betrayal. And so Psalm 55 is a prayer, kind of bounces back and forth between requests for God to hear and for God to respond, protest against what the author is experiencing. He gives these declarations of hope and faith in God. But it really is a vibrant or picture of a heartfelt prayer. And it should help us to understand that sometimes in prayer, there can be these big emotional swings. In a single time of prayer, you can feel very high, very low, very stressed, very relieved. And so we don't necessarily know the occasion of this psalm and when it was written, but what we do know is that he's in the midst of some sorrow. He's in the midst of some trouble. So some of the things that we see in this passage, verse 3 tells us that there are some enemies present. Verse 13 tells us that there is this betrayal of his close friends. Verses 1 through 5 tell us he's in great emotional distress. But by the time we get to the end of the psalm, verse 22 indicates that God is his burden bearer and his caretaker. But let's deal with the first part of it first, because this psalm we're going to look at for a couple of days. Verses 1 through 5 gives this really vivid description of his emotional state. It tells us things like he's crying for help, that he's overwhelmed, his heart is racing, he's physically shaking. And I suspect all of us have had moments like that in our life. I know I have, where I've been just so overwhelmed where physically you could see some of the effects of it. And this psalm is intended for us, or at least that's how we should receive it, as an encouragement to pray during times of trouble. Verse 6 and 7, though, points out this irony in the story. David wishes for wings like a dove, but the place that he wants to fly to is not a city. It's not the tabernacle for worship. It's to the wilderness. And if we look at David's life and think about his wilderness experience, we would have to understand that this isn't a pleasant moment in David's life. He was being pursued by Saul prior to him becoming king, and he was considered one of Israel's most wanted people. And so he went and lived and hid in the wilderness, and the people he lived with in the caves said they were people who were in distress, people who were in debt, people who were discontented. And most of the time, if we get to choose the people we hang out with, that's typically not who we're going to choose. And you can find that in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. In chapter 23 of 1 Samuel, we find that he's constantly having to stay on the move. So why is it that he would choose to fly to go back to the wilderness? Like, if you had an option, if you got your wish granted that you got wings and you could fly wherever you wanted to, would it be to a place where you were on the run, where you were hanging out with people who were in great distress? But what we also find is in the wilderness, God delivered his enemies into his hands. In chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, it says, Now's your opportunity, David's men whispered to him. Today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do as you wish. So David crept forward and cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. David didn't kill him, but God put him right in his hands. And then in chapter 26, it says, God has surely handed your enemy over to you this time, Abishai whispered to David. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of a spear. I won't need to strike him twice. And then David says, no, don't kill him. So we find another enemy delivered into David's hands. We find that he was delivered from Nabal, and the Lord takes Nabal's life. It says in verse 38, about 10 days later. So after he's been very shown some animosity toward David and been ungrateful. It says about 10 days later, the Lord struck him and he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise the Lord who has avenged the insult I received from Nabal and has kept me from doing it myself." And then in chapter 30, it says he was delivered from the Amalekites. So nothing was missing, small or great. This is verse 19 of chapter 30. Son or daughter, nor anything else that had been taken. David brought everything back. He also recovered all the flocks and herds, and his men drove them ahead of the other livestock. "This plunder belongs to David," they said. The truth is that none of us are ordering trials. None of us want to go through it. We don't want to have to face dangers. We don't want to have to live in this wilderness place. But one of the things that I think we would all agree on is that those seasons often develop a closeness or a dependence on God that we can't develop anywhere else. And sometimes after God shows himself faithful in those situations, we find ourselves wanting to return back to that closeness, but that closeness sometimes only happens in those moments of pressure and pain and tension and hurt and heartache. So, Wendy, let's talk about this for a little while. First, have you ever found yourself glad that you had come out of a particular troubled time, but you missed the closeness that you felt when you were there?
Glad to be out of a troubled time, absolutely. Everybody is. You're happy on the other side of that. But longing for that closeness, absolutely, because when you're in the midst of those things, I find myself kind of laser focused in my prayer life. And I think those seasons are for purpose, for your building you up, for that particular reason, for strengthening you, for strengthening your faith, because you become so focused on spending that time with God and the purpose in your prayer and actively looking for how he moves. When you're not so keenly aware all the time about how he's working in your life, in those seasons, you're looking, how is he going to answer? This is my specific prayer. I'm coming to him, fervently, constantly, and I'm constantly watching for how he's going to work and move in my life. And it made me think about when I was teaching school, when I was asking kids to read a certain passage in order to get information, I would constantly ask them, read the questions first before you read. And the reason why was because it gave them purpose for the reading. You're looking for answers while you're reading. And it was just that same idea with that praying and going through those trials and tribulations. When you're praying with that purpose, you're looking for the specific ways God's going to move. You're looking for the answers. You're looking for how he's going to move during those seasons. And this is neither here nor there, but I had to think about, have you ever watched Forrest Gump?
Yeah, a long time ago.
Do you remember when his love interest, Jenny, was a little girl and she runs out of the house? This psalm immediately made me think about that. Her prayer when she ran out of the house, she was abused when she was a child. Her prayer was, "Dear God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far away." And that's those words, and it just resonated in my head. And it's one of those, I think, primal things for David, like in this instance, it's that fight or flight. And sometimes you're just so weak, so weary, especially when it's a troubling trial. You just don't have the energy to fight. You just want the flight.
Right.
You just want to get away. And for him, the wilderness was a place of almost comfort because he found commiseration. Like you noted that he had all of those people who were also outcast or people down on their luck with him.
Right.
They found community together and they drew strength from one another. So that's another purpose in those seasons. It's not just leaning into God and finding how he works and moves in life and strengthening your faith, but also building some community outside of that.
There are some places where we're more comfortable than other places.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes my experience is that we've all been through difficult times and we thought, man, this is really bad.
Mm.
And then we go through something that's worse and we're like, I would rather have that. Right. You
Right.
know,
Yeah. It's relative.
Yeah,
It's
that's
all
right. The illustration that I would use there about wanting to go back would be in parenting. You know, I hear parents of toddlers going, oh gosh, I can't wait till they grow out of this.
Just you wait.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Just
Yeah,
you wait.
yeah. Wait till they can talk back. Wait till
Mm-hmm.
they can drive. Wait till
Yeah.
they can, don't have to listen, because then you got a whole complete different set of challenges. You're like, man,
Mm-hmm.
I would really go back to that. I was complaining about how bad it was,
Yeah.
And there could have been some of that going on with David. He could have complained about, man, this was a tough time in my life, but
Yeah.
now this is tougher. I appreciate that a little bit more. But I do think that one of the struggles, and I don't want to say we can't have that closeness with God in good times.
Right.
I don't want to say we can't, because I do believe we can. But all relationships have ebbs and flows,
Right.
Peaks and valleys.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't be on a spiritual roller coaster,
No.
but there's this up and downward motion, a wave, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's not always up and to the right.
This is life rhythms.
That's right. And so I think that those moments sometimes help us get back in focus.
Mm-hmm.
But I think how you talked about how you framed it, when you're in trouble, you are specifically looking for some certain things. It's much like reading the Bible. If I'm going through a particular trouble, when I read the Bible, I see things through that lens that I hadn't seen before, because that thing is, the same is true. I tell people sometimes, if I'm preparing for a series, let's say on money or marriage or whatever, I'm looking through that lens when I read the scripture, and that lens dictates a lot of what I see.
Right.
And that I think that's true, that your trouble dictates a lot of what you see, because you're looking for, and sometimes we misguided with it, but most of the time it is beneficial to us. How would it change our perspective during troubled times if we could stop and focus on God's presence? How would you encourage people to be able to do that who might be going through a tough time today?
Stopping in those moments sometimes is just hard, because you're just flooded with your hurt, whatever your trial is. But taking the opportunity to just stop, almost, allowing God to just grab you by the shoulders and say, wait, just be still for a second and wait, and take some rest with me. Just calm down. That's the one thing you want to hear when you're struggling, is calm down. But that's what he wants to do.
Nobody responds to that.
No, it's not.
Do you respond very well when Todd tells you that?
I don't. He's a wise man. He wouldn't do that. But really, God is asking to trust. Come, rest here. Let's take a break. I've got you.
Mm-hmm.
I've got this. He repeats that over and over in his word. If that becomes where we go every time, that becomes our first response, then boy, we've set ourselves up for success over and over again.
Yeah. The reset that trouble brings, and the lesson that I learn typically in difficult times, it's just not nearly as much about me as I want it to be. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not nearly as smart or resilient or strong or any of the above. There has to be some dependency on him. And when I do that, then I can move forward. And until I learn that lesson, sometimes it's hard to move forward.
And sometimes the toughest lesson is when you're sitting with God and he points out to you that a lot of this trouble is you.
Mm-hmm.
Man, sometimes that's why you resist going, because you already know the answer.
Right.
So just face up to it.
That's
But
right.
that's why he's there. He's the mirror that you need
To look
look
in.
in.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Psalms.